Ancient places, heritage defined. Ancient places, know your heritage. Ancient places, start with definition.
Ancient places, heritage polkas. Start with a definition. Know what you see. Shape of the object, meaning of the thing. Place and practice, tangible, unseen. Ritual structure, landscape in between. Written in law, the national estate. Define it clearly before it's too late. Ancient places, heritage bouquets. Ancient places, heritage polkas.
There's a simple mistake that many of us make in heritage practice. We open the National Heritage Resources Act and we go straight to the sections that govern our work. These sections could include Section 38, which is the trigger for heritage impact assessments, or Section 34, structures older than 60 years, Section 35, archaeology and paleontology, Section 36, graves and burial grounds. We may go to the sections that discuss permits, triggers, compliance. We tend to go directly to what we need to do. Most practitioners read the National Heritage Resources Act as follows: sections, then procedures, then compliance. We begin with the sections that trigger our work, particularly Section 38, which tells us when a heritage impact assessment is required, and we then refer to Sections 34, 35, and 36 primarily, which deals with structures, archaeology, and graves. From there, we move into procedures, such as what must be done, what must be included, how the assessment must be structured, and how it fits into broader environmental processes. And all of this is understood within a framework of compliance, such as the legal requirements of the Act and the consequences if those requirements are not met. When faced with a potential development project, stakeholders in development tend to ask ourselves practical questions such as, do we need an HIA? Or, is the structure older than 60 years of age? Or, do we need a permit? So, although these are practical questions, and they do and they should guide our decision making, shape our reports, and determine what action is taken on the ground, they're not necessarily the first questions that we should be asking ourselves. And this is because the Act is designed to work in a different order. And this order is definitions first, sections next, and then procedures. So, in other words, the Act first defines what things actually are, and then it tells you what to do about them. So, if you skip the first step, you are applying the rest of the Act to something you have not properly understood. As an example, let me take Section 38 of the National Heritage Resources Act, which is Heritage Resources Management. Now, this Act specifically outlines the requirements for heritage impact assessments when certain types of development projects are proposed. Now, the key triggers for Section 38 are linear developments, such as roads, walls, pipelines, or power lines exceeding 300 meters, bridges, structures exceeding 50 meters, site development, which are activities changing the character of a site over 5,000 meters squared, involving 3 or more subdivided or consolidated urban, or rezoning a site over 10,000 square meters. So to continue with this example, the first question we would ask is, does this trigger Section 38? Does a particular development trigger Section 38? In other words, is the development large enough? Will it change the landscape? Could it impact heritage resources? And if the answer is yes, then a heritage impact assessment is required. And from there, the process begins. But notice what we've done. We've started with the trigger. We've started with the section itself. But we haven't yet asked, what is it that we are actually measuring? That answer is not in Section 38. It's in the definitions. The section dealing with definitions in the NHRA is quite substantial, and it includes concepts such as heritage resource, cultural significance, living heritage, structure, and site. Now, each of these concepts are not only loaded with social value, but they also have legal associations. And these legal and social values associated with the concepts are what decide what we see in the field. So, for instance, let's chase the following process through. If your understanding of heritage resource is narrow, you are already limiting what you will find. But because in the Act under definitions, a heritage resource is defined as any place or object of cultural significance, we then understand that this definition turns on the concept of cultural significance or the term of cultural significance. And in the definitions, the Act defines cultural significance. And you can see that we are cross-referencing as including aesthetic value, architectural value, historical value, scientific value, social value, spiritual value, linguistic value, and technological value. And I just want to re-emphasize the point that if you are to use the Act correctly, you will find that you will be required to do quite a lot of cross-referencing. So this is the critical link. Those values are not confined to objects or buildings or artifacts or to any single heritage element. They extend to landscapes because value can be spatial, environmental, and experiential, to associations because value can be historical, social, or symbolic, to cultural meaning because value can be spiritual, linguistic, or social, and to living heritage because value can be embodied in ongoing practice. In other words, any one heritage element can have multiple associations and meanings, and even layered meanings. So if you read heritage resource narrowly as physical fabric, you will only identify buildings, structures, artifacts, statues, as in the visual example I give, and other visible remains. But if you follow the Act properly through cultural significance in the definitions, you are required to recognize non-physical and relational forms of heritage, including the not easily identifiable intangible elements. So the Act, through the definitions, expands our scope of understanding, particularly through the definition of cultural significance. Through the definition of cultural significance, the Act requires heritage to be understood beyond the physical. Cultural significance means aesthetic, architectural, historical, scientific, social, spiritual, linguistic, or technological value or significance. And that's in section 2, the definitions. So everything we have just described, landscapes, associations, cultural meaning, living heritage, all of these come directly from the definitions section of the Act. And it's how the Act itself constructs the field. The Act defines a heritage resource as any place or object of cultural significance, and cultural significance in terms of a wide range of values, including social, spiritual, historical, aesthetic, and more. It also defines concepts such as place, site, structure, living heritage. So the implication is unavoidable. Before you ever reach Section 38, the Act has already determined what may be recognized. So when we identify elements or concepts such as landscapes, associations, or living practices, and the intangibles associated with the living heritage, we are not extending the Act, but rather we are applying it correctly. So I'm going to use Section 34 of the NHRA structures as an example. Now, using this section, it provides a convenient legal trigger. The Act uses it as a starting point, but it doesn't stop there. The real task is to look beyond just structures and consider all those intangible aspects, the social, the historical, and so forth. So yes, in this example, structures is a starting example, but not the whole picture. So let's look at the diagram here again. We begin with a structure, something seemingly simple, such as a barn. We then move inward, or we look for deep meaning. Even with a simple structure, such as a barn, we can already see layers. It could have been a stable to begin with, and then a home. And then it became a heritage site because of something that might have happened in the home, or someone who might have lived in the home, who might have been famous, and so on. So each phase leaves a trace. We can then expand outward. And this is where the image becomes really powerful. And from the structure radiates associations such as memory, identity, ritual, function. We can even see time inscribed in the fabric. It's such an elusive concept, but it can become concretized if you view heritage elements in a comprehensive manner, using the act correctly. So the act becomes the meaning-making system that is able to transform a building into heritage. So going back to the barn example, if we isolate the structure, we will miss everything that gives it significance. But if we follow its associations in the act, then the building becomes a text, something that can be read, interpreted, and contested. Continuing with the example of Section 34 structures. The danger lies in treating a structure as something that is neutral. Of course it isn't. Every association reflects power and agency with what is remembered, what is forgotten, and who decides. And while I've used Section 34 structures as my example, I could equally have used Section 35 archaeology, paleontology and meteorites, or Section 36 burial grounds and graves, or Section 37 public monuments and memorials. So the same logic applies to any heritage element, whether it's an artifact, a place, or a practice. The key is always how we define and recognize the significance, not just the category of the item. So every section in the act has a different focus, and the definitions are the foundation for everything. We need to keep the balance. We must consider both tangibles and intangibles equally. We use the sections to trigger action, but we can't lose sight of the definitions. They are what gives the whole process its depth. So in a sentence, the scope of heritage is established in the definitions. So we need to really ground each example in its own logic. For each type of heritage, whether it's a building, an object, or a practice, we need to show how the act's definitions guide us to recognize its cultural significance and keep the emphasis balanced. Both the tangible and intangible aspects are crucial. Every section in the act has a different focus, and the definitions are the foundation for everything. So what we need to do is to keep the balance. Yes, we use the sections to trigger action, but we can't lose sight of the definitions. They are what gives the whole process its depth. So to consolidate, the scope of heritage is established in the definitions. In practice, something predictable happens when we use the NHRA. We begin to lean too heavily on individual sections of the act. Each section becomes a trigger. They are used as a quick way to decide, does this qualify, and does this activate protection? But each section only addresses a specific type of heritage or a specific kind of action. And every section depends on how its key terms are understood. And this is where things start to go wrong. When we rely on sections in isolation, we start to treat categories as fixed and obvious. We assume we know what counts as a structure, an object, a site, a practice, but those are not self-evident. They are defined terms, and those definitions are often broader, more layered, and more flexible than we assume. If any of these categories are interpreted too narrowly, we begin to exclude things without realizing it. I mean, for instance, we should be on the lookout for places that are fragmentary, altered, or not formally recognized, objects whose meaning lies more in use than in form, landscapes that don't fit neat boundaries, or practices that are embedded in place but not immediately visible. The result is subtle but serious. We don't just misclassify heritage, we fail to see it at all. So the sections are still working exactly as they should, but the definitions beneath them are not being actively engaged. So the outcome becomes constrained, not by the act itself, but by how we are reading it. Now, the core principle of this podcast is that the sections trigger action, while definitions determine meaning. If we start with a section, we get a procedural response. If we start with a definition, we open up interpretation. And this has significance because when definitions fall into the background, decision-making becomes mechanical, complex or layered heritage becomes invisible, tangible and intangible elements become separated when they shouldn't be, and the depth of cultural significance is flattened. So the shift in approach that we need to make is, instead of asking which section applies, we need to begin with what is this according to the Act's definitions, and how does it hold meaning materially and immaterially. Only then do we move to ask which section is triggered. So to tighten this in one sentence, let me say that sections guide what we do, but definitions determine what we are dealing with. When definitions are not fully understood, some things are consistently overlooked, particularly living heritage, cultural significance beyond the visible, and sites without obvious material remains. These are the soft and intangible aspects of culture. And while these are not unusual, they are simply harder to see. And we can see this by the fact that they are often missing from NHRA reports, simply because many heritage officers and assessors are not trained to look or fully understand intangible heritage, and nor are they trained to use the NHRA correctly. And if intangibles are not identified, then they do not enter the report, and they are not assessed, and they are not protected. In effect, they do not exist in the system. So we return to a very simple point. When you start with the sections, you focus on process. When you start with the definitions, you understand what you're dealing with. In conclusion, then, definitions decide what we see. Sections decide what we do. But if we begin in the wrong place, we can still follow the process perfectly, but still miss the truth entirely. I'd just like to make mention here of my heritage consultancy company, which is based in KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape, Ancient Places Heritage Consultancy. Together with my sub-consultants, we offer all forms of heritage assessment, including general HRAs and cultural assessments. We also offer paleontology and specialize in built heritage assessments. And we're skilled in assessing both tangible and intangible heritage. And to contact me, you can use the email address that you will find on my channel page. Thank you for joining this podcast. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you'd like to receive updates on all our heritage episodes. Until next time, cheers.
Ancient places, heritage. Start with a definition. Know what you see, shape of the object, meaning of the thing, place and practice, tangible, unseen, ritual, structure, land, instinct in between. Written in law, the national estate, define it clearly before it's too late. Ancient places,